Welcome, everyone. I'm Christy Anderson, and along with Joseph Clarke, who will introduce himself in a second, we really wanted to welcome you to the first of too much alliteration, but Canada Constructed Conversations, which is a series of events that we're going to plan over this winter, this term, and going forward into next summer and on about Canadian architecture, and especially about teaching architecture landscapes, cities of Canada and in Canada. So I teach, my primary home is in the art history department, and I also do a bit of teaching in the Daniel School of Architecture. My own field is in Renaissance and Baroque architecture, though increasingly shifting to looking at things in North America and especially in Canada. And this project, the Canada Constructed project, this event that you're at is part of a larger project called Canada Constructed that Joseph and I began, I guess it started really over the summer, which is a program that's centered in the history of art department, the art history department at U of T, but it's really a partnership program with other departments and groups at the University of Toronto, like geography, Canadian studies, Indigenous studies, the School of Cities, the Daniels, and so on, which is intended to encourage and engage students in all of these units in a series of courses, from first-year seminars for students just coming into the university, as well as kind of introductory courses like gateway courses and upper level research seminars. The project is funded right now for 3 years through a very generous grant through the U of T provost called a LEAF grant. And our goal is really on the pedagogical and the teaching side of the project. I mean, although research is certainly a part of it, but it's really about engaging students. So what part of the project will involve developing new pedagogical approaches for the teaching of architecture in Canada through project-based and experiential learning. We're going to develop a series of internships that will be open to U of T students starting this summer and then going forward. So ways to get students into the community. There will be research seminars, opportunities for students to work in professional organizations, primarily within Ontario, but also, especially these days, especially beyond. We're helped, and we could not do this without our extraordinary postdoctoral student, Jessica Mace, who is right there waving. Jess, who also, in addition to helping us for 3 years on this project, she serves as editor of the Journal of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada. She's on the executive committee of the Association of Critical Heritage Studies, and her most recent publication includes a book entitled Identity on the Land, Company Towns in Canada, which is co-authored with Lucy Morissette. We're also very grateful for the help of Katrin Zavgorodny-Friedman, who is an MA student in the art history department and is serving as our student research assistant. Joseph, if I may turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Christy. Hello, everybody. I'm Joseph Clarke. I'm also here at the University of Toronto Department of Art History. I'm an assistant professor of modern architecture, really specializing in issues of architectural disciplinarity and media. My background is originally as an architect. I was trained as an architect and worked for Peter Eisenman and for Skidmore, Owings and Merrill before going back into architectural history. My book coming out in a few months is about European architects' efforts to conceptualize sound as a spatial phenomenon in 18th and 19th century Europe. But like Christy, I've been moving slowly into teaching and research on North American and Canadian topics. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three panelists that we're very excited to have talk to us today. I'll just introduce all three, and then we'll invite them to give a brief opening presentation, and then we'll move into some questions and discussion. So joining us today are Peter Coffman, an associate professor at Carleton University's History and Theory of Architecture program, where he serves as undergraduate supervisor. He's a specialist in medieval and Gothic revival architecture. He authored the book Newfoundland Gothic, in addition to many essays and articles. Kaufman is a former president of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada and an award-winning photographer. We also have with us Michael Windover, who is himself also an associate professor at Carleton and associate director of the School for Studies of Art and Culture at Carleton. He's published especially on modern architecture and media, particularly radio, as well as on Art Deco. So he's the author of Art Deco, A Mode of Mobility, and co-author of the book Seeing, Selling, and Situating Radio in Canada, 1922 to 56. And he is currently vice president of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada. And I should say that Peter and Michael were co-recipients of a 2019 teaching award from Carleton for their Virtual Museum of Architecture in Ottawa project, which they're going to tell us about today. Joining them on the panel is Jane Wolff, an associate professor at the University of Toronto Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. Wolfe is a landscape architect with a background also in documentary filmmaking. Her most recent book, Bay Lexicon, is a field guide to San Francisco's shoreline. She also does quite a bit of work on Toronto's metropolitan landscape and shoreline. And she's been particularly active in public engagement. So she's exhibited work at the Toronto Biennial of Art, and then also bringing this approach into her teaching in the Master of Landscape Architecture program with her field studies course, in which students document and analyze the city's ecology. So welcome to the three of you. And I guess we can now turn the floor over to Peter, or I don't know if you and Michael were going to present jointly.
Actually, we've got it sequentially and chronologically. I'm set up to go first. So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for having this, and thank you everyone for coming. It's great to see some familiar faces in the Hollywood squares, but people, of course, I haven't actually gotten together with in quite a long time. I'm going to start off the Carleton component of this by giving you a bit of an overview of how we've incorporated Canadian, we meaning Michael and I in the History and Theory of Architecture program, how we've incorporated Canadian and in particular Ottawa architecture into our teaching for the last few years. And just to give you some context for that, Michael and I teach in the History and Theory of Architecture program, which I think is unique as an undergrad program in at least English-speaking Canada, in that it is actually an undergraduate degree in architectural history. And our grads tend to go on to study, to get, if our grads go on to master's degrees, they tend to go on either in the field of architecture itself, or in heritage, or more and more going into planning, and sometimes, although actually not that often, in art history. So from the, why isn't this working? It's, I gotta figure out how to let this get, okay, there we go. So from the time I arrived at Carleton about 10 years ago, we've been making firsthand experience of the built environment of Ottawa into as available a thing as possible through a lot of field trips. And I show you some examples here. Most of the field trips are in Ottawa, although the top left one is actually in Montreal, something that Michael arranged around Art Deco in Montreal. But generally our field trips are close to home and in Ottawa. But we do, and have for quite some time, tried to make this direct experience of our own local architecture an integral part of the experience here in HTA. And these trips, of course, are voluntary and they're very informal, but we've also integrated them into our curriculum. And our first, second, and third year core courses all integrate at least some Ottawa architecture into them. And in each case, the students are required and expected to actually visit architectural sites rather than just read about them. And as we go year by year up the ladder, the buildings are used, first of all, just to enhance basic architectural and formal literacy, then as essentially outdoor laboratories for the discussion of various broad themes and issues in architecture, and then as case studies for the application of intellectual lenses that our students study in their methods course. So we've started integrating local Ottawa architecture into our courses in that way. And we've also integrated Ottawa architecture into what we call our practicum. That's a one-term arrangement where students spend a certain number of hours every week working in some sort of institution or organization that is related to our program, and they get academic credit for it. And here we've got a couple of students in the insert. We've got a couple of students who did interpretive work, historical research and interpretive work for the Strutt House, the house of a local architect of considerable importance named Jim Strutt. That's his house. It was dilapidated for quite some time. It was decided to fix it up, turn it into a museum, and our practicum students got to work on that project as researchers and to create interpretive material for that. So all of this has worked pretty well, although both Michael and I think, had a sense of a certain amount of unfulfilled potential because of the rich texture of architecture that is right here at our fingertips in Ottawa. It actually has probably more interesting architecture on a whole number of different levels than a medium-sized Canadian city ought to have, because of course it's a national capital. And just to give you a few examples of that, when people think of Ottawa, think of architecture, of course you think government. And Parliament buildings are here, federal government's here, so that's true. But of course, government means a lot of different things in Ottawa. We've got the federal government, Parliament, federal government architecture also means things like the Diefenbunker, the Cold War bunker on the bottom right. And of course, we have other levels of government, like civic government, that's the City Hall, Old City Hall on the bottom left, and the NCC, God love them, and that's their headquarters on the top left. So we've got several levels of government here, and a lot of different government architecture actually means a wide range of different things. And of course, being a capital city, we've got diplomatic architecture. It's an incredible range of both purpose-built and repurposed buildings that now serve as embassies and other types of cultural institutions for governments and administrations from abroad. Now, of course, we've got a huge range of domestic architecture as well, ranging from small cottages like what we have in Britannia Village on the top right, to row houses, to apartment buildings, to mid-century modern jewels like name's not coming to Hart Massey House on the top left. And of course, again, being a capital, we've got a real range of other types of commercial and institutional buildings. Commercial, everything from hotels, banks, office buildings, plazas, all the things that a city would normally have of this size. And institutional buildings like what we have here clockwise from top left is an Indigenous Health Center, Supreme Court, Post Office, Bank of Canada. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. It gives you some sense of the range of building types we have here and the range of buildings within that type. So we really have this strong sense that there's untapped potential here, and we wanted to find some way to unlock more of those possibilities for our students to study the architecture of Ottawa, to study building types, to study the functions of buildings, to study the interaction of people with the built environment, introduce themes of politics, gender, class, indigeneity. It's all here. It's all right here at our fingertips. So we're really trying to think of ways to drill down into that more and exploit that potential. And that's when we invented this project that we're calling the Virtual Museum of Architecture in Ottawa. And that is where I'll turn it over to Michael to discuss that. And I have to stop screen sharing if I can figure out how. There we go. Over to you, Michael. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Let's just do that. And then, oops, share. And then, And everybody can see that okay? So, hi, everybody. Again, as Peter says, so nice to see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm looking forward to our conversation about teaching Canadian architecture, or just teaching online and or teaching these days, I don't know. And I'm going to pick up where Peter left off and talk about how we sort of moved from these sort of one-off class assignments to something that's more of a project, program-wide project, and that's the Virtual Museum of Architecture in Ottawa. So in some ways, the seeds of this started in our day-to-day classes. And when I first started at Carleton, in my first winter term, I had a class doing work on Art Deco in Ottawa, and you can see them working in the collection of the Science and Technology Museum. And I worked with our Audiovisual Resource Center to have them do sort of artifact analysis and put them in and write up stuff about these individual artifacts. And this was sort of a test case for them. A was showing them about material culture and that sort of thing, but also how they can use these artifacts to tell compelling stories, which they did. And again, they did this through the platform Omeka, and they worked in groups and they produced little exhibits. And you can see again, a lot of our great collection of buildings that Peter just talked about. For example, the Supreme Court, the Bank of Canada, the pool, the Art Deco pool at the Chateau Laurier, the Mayfair Theatre, etc. And so the students worked together in teams and learned how to use artifacts to tell compelling stories. And this was sort of a one-off thing. The Omeka program didn't work as well with the AVRC. And so in subsequent years, I tried using another platform called Scalar for classes. And again, students had an opportunity to work with, we could call it archival, primary type documents, digitized things, and create, in this case, Scalar, they call them online chapters, or online books, but the same idea. So putting that emphasis on working with primary materials and finding another way to produce or to find an audience, I guess, for a potential audience for their work, rather than your typical essay. Again, the idea is that these students are doing all this work, and usually only we, the professors, get a chance to read it. And so not all of these things were published, but in some cases they were. And so this got us thinking about, could we find a way to harness the research that students are doing and create something that could become a research tool for others, as well as a pedagogical tool, and maybe something that is along the lines of the kind of work that Eric Arthur was doing at the University of Toronto in the 20th century with his students doing measured drawings and photographic work. Which became a part of the foundation for the Canadian Inventory of Historic Buildings. So we were thinking, well, maybe we could have our students do that kind of data collection and then move into an interpretive arena and make these things available to a broader public. And that's where VML really came from. So again, the idea is that this is first and foremost, a pedagogical project for us. And eventually we'd like to see it become a kind of public-facing research tool. And so as Peter was saying, in our second year, for example, we designed a course called Experiencing Architecture, where students, a big chunk of the course is students going out and dealing firsthand with buildings and a variety of different issues. Well, what if their photographs or their soundscapes or the things that they gathered from that could be collected and added to a kind of digital repository so that they could then use these later, or other students could use them as well. That was sort of the thinking behind it. And in the third year in our methods course, we've started to have students do just that, where they go and they either gather the materials themselves. At this point, that's pretty much what we have to do, but also use things that are already available. And these are a few examples of some of the sites that students dealt with last semester. With the pandemic, they were caught having to do things completely online. And so For example, they worked on St. Pat's, the building that our department is situated in. And by going through archival material related to the Charlatan, which is the local, like our Carleton's student newspaper, they were able to pull out stories about the building, right? So one of the things that we try to do in that course, right, is emphasize primary documents and how we use them and what kind of stories can be told, and how we can explore the sort of longer life of buildings, right? Not just the moment they're erected when it's all shiny and new, but when they're lived and that sort of thing. So again, how architecture is and becomes rather than just sort of was. We've also used it in other courses as well. I tried it out with a course that I did on interiors. And again, students gathered materials and produced a kind of exhibit as a kind of dissemination tool rather than your sort of standard essay. And all of this eventually is to culminate in a fourth year capstone project or class rather, that Peter and I are actually doing for the first time this year. We're co-teaching it. This is one of the nice things about having a generous colleague like Peter, is that we can work together and we co-teach regularly now. And so this past year, we co-taught the second year core course as well as this new fourth year seminar. And it happened, and Peter, feel free to jump in if you want to add detail, but that the Carleton Place and Beckwith Heritage Museum was looking for a way to explore and celebrate and examine its architectural history. And we were looking for a case study for our fourth year seminar, and the sort of stars aligned. And so our students this semester are going to be working closely with Jennifer Irwin, who is the manager of the Carleton Place and Beckwith Heritage Museum. And our students are going to work primarily with these original documents that have been scanned and newspapers and that sort of thing. And they are going to produce, in the end, a series of exhibits for the museum. So in this way, not only are they honing their skills at the end of their time at Carleton as a kind of capstone course, but they also are going to be sort of working for a client, right? And so they're going to be picking up other opportunities or other skills and that sort of thing as well, we hope. And it's a really exciting partnership, and it's the kind of thing that we were thinking about, but it was just wonderful the way this sort of fell together. And the fact that unfortunately we can't get there has also meant that we have to think through things online. And so I think in some ways this is one of the silver linings of this kind of dreadful time we're living in right now. So this is just a real snapshot of the virtual museum. I'm sure there'll be some questions about it that Peter and I can answer, unless Peter, you want to jump in right now and add anything to it. But I just want to give you some sense of how this fits into the HTA program, beginning with second year into our methods interpretive third year course, and then finally into this fourth year capstone course. Peter, did you want to add anything?
Actually, I'll just add, I don't think you mentioned this. Carleton Place is a small community, just about a 30-minute drive outside Ottawa. So it's not quite within Ottawa, but it's right next door. So it's still very local.
Thanks. I had it in my notes, and I didn't read any of my notes as I was talking. So
just on the off chance that there's someone in Toronto who doesn't know where Carleton Place is.
That's right. Okay, so I can stop the screen share. How do I do that again? Here we go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter and Michael. And now we'll turn to Jane Wolff.
So thanks to Joseph and Christy for asking me to talk about the field course that I teach. It's I think, my very favorite course. It's a foundational course in our master's program in landscape architecture. And its purpose is to build literacy in the plural systems that shape intensely inhabited landscapes. We ask the students to think of themselves as landscape detectives. And before the pandemic, Toronto served as the laboratory for the course. It's a great example because its metropolitan landscape is so clearly the product of long and reiterative interactions among cultural demands and geographical circumstances and environmental processes. So the course aimed to develop observational and analytical skills that would let our students learn the skills of decoding landscapes, with the idea that they would probably take them to other places, because the makeup of our master's cohort is very, very international. So before the pandemic, what we did was to walk a range of sites together, sites that speak to the landscape's hybridity and multiplicity at urban and regional scales. And so what you're seeing here is some of the places that we used to go all together. The Toronto Islands on the upper left-hand corner, on the upper right-hand corner, the Fishway, which is a fish kind of obstacle course at Burlington Bay. Bottom left is the Oak Ridges Moraine, and bottom right is the R.C. Harris water purification plant. Okay, so in the class, in its former iteration, the students would produce drawings in the field, kind of like the one you see on the right, but also measured sections in their sketchbooks. And then they would synthesize their field drawings to tell their own stories about, except I skipped a slide. Sorry. Right, so every field trip we took, every walk, every day we spent in the field was a kind of story with a map. And so in this instance, the map is showing our route along the path of Garrison Creek, which was buried in the late 19th century. And we walked together from Fort York, where it met Lake Ontario when Fort York was at the shoreline, all the way to its headwaters above St. Clair Avenue. It's a distance of about 10 or 12 kilometers. And the students had the exercise of looking for the traces of the creek in the fabric of the city. So for every day, one of these maps and one of these walks. And what they made was a combination of field drawings and then synthetic drawings that asked them to tell their own stories about the places they'd seen. So for instance, on the left-hand side, a collection of drawings that describes the agency of invasive species in Burlington Bay and at the Fishway, that structure that I showed you a moment ago. Now, after the pandemic, the course had to be totally reinvented because the students were all over the world. And so Toronto became one of many laboratories for landscape observation, and the exercises had to be reimagined to be completely portable. So the strategy was to develop a series of observation and drawing exercises along a 1 kilometer transect that could begin anywhere, so at any student's house. And the students walked that transect every day of the course, looking at it from different points of view that were framed by conversations with people with different expertise, looking at and walking around the same site, our faculty at Once Medina. So I talked about the lay of the land. Ange Loft, who's a Ganawage Mohawk artist, talked about coming to the city. Jenny Hill, an engineer and hydrologist, talked about drainage surfaces and structures. Daniela Puric-Mladenovich, who's a forester and planner, talked about trees and their stories. Doug Anderson, who is a Métis educator, talked about relationships to and on land. And Sandy Smith, who's an entomologist, talked about trees in the context of space and time. And so what the students made was quite different. They took the same walk every day looking for different things: the terrain, the presence of water, trees, herbaceous plants and animals, including people, conditions of climate and light. And the idea was to let their observations accumulate through a set of drawings that became more and more developed, more and more rich as the week went on. So what you're seeing here is a little screen capture from an article on our website showing two students in totally different places, Afsa Ali in Brampton on the left and Sophie Yan in Weifang, China on the right. And then a screen capture from our digital bulletin board on Miro. So the students worked in groups by time zone and consulted with each other about their individual project over the course of every day, and then posted their work so that we all had a sense about how the exercises were accumulating. And as Joseph mentioned, this kind of endeavor is closely related to my own research work. So just a couple of images from an installation at the Toronto Biennial in the fall of 2019, an observatory for the shoreline that included different kinds of artifacts, devices, and documents through which to think about the shoreline and its evolution. And then some images from a walk we took from and to back to the observatory, again with a bunch of different experts and knowledge holders of both Indigenous and Western technical and more humanities-driven understandings of place. So that's what I've got, and thanks for your patience with my PowerPoint confusion.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jane, and thanks, Peter and Michael. So there are many points in there that we will want to follow up on. A lot of specific aspects of your teaching, and also the question of the general question of digital tools and the kind of having to adapt to the conditions of the pandemic. But before we get to some of those specifics, I wanted to start with a question for all three of you, kind of zooming out, or I don't know, maybe that's a bad metaphor, but taking a step back about how you describe the object or the field of your teaching and research. So the question is, do you identify as a specialist in the Canadian physical environment? This is sort of a question about the convention of adopting a nation, Canada, as the descriptor for one's field of expertise, and in the way that you present the course to students. And I should say that Christy and I chose the name Canada Constructed for our project because we did think it was important to identify with Canada as such, but also understanding that national identity is not a kind of naturally occurring phenomenon, but one that's constructed in part through design. So I wanted to ask all three of you how you negotiate this question. Do you describe yourself and your courses as being about the architectural landscapes of Canada specifically, and kind of what role does this category of national identity play in what you do? So actually, anybody who wants to jump in, or I can call on one of you.
I can start off and say that certainly in my research, I call myself Canadianist, and I think it's very appropriate to do so because I work on 19th century material. And in the whole idea that the nation state is the sort of fundamental guiding hand to personal experience and identity is a 19th century idea and the architecture is saturated in that idea. So I'm able to say, in terms of my research, I call myself a Canadianist in a way that actually is both accurate and avoids all the really difficult issues that you raise. And in terms of teaching, and certainly with the virtual museum, we certainly identify that as Canadian too. And again, for very pragmatic reasons, in that we are looking at what is at hand. We are getting students to go out and explore buildings, explore archives, explore that sort of thing with stuff at hand. So the fact that it's all at hand and experienced firsthand inevitably means it's Canadian. Again, that very conveniently skirts the fundamental issues. But I think it's legitimate to do that. Canada is a political and an economic and a legal entity that has some meaning. I mean, I think where none of us wants to go with that is saying this is what Canadian architecture is, or there is a Canadian architecture. I mean, you go down that road and you end up going down the road of John Harvey. And I don't think any of us wants to go there. So I think it's a useful term as long as we acknowledge its limitations.
Jane or Michael?
Sure, I can jump in. My answer to your question is it depends, which is also one of those great answers. Some classes that I've taught are specifically on Canadian architecture. So, for example, I've taught a fourth-year seminar on post-war Canadian, architecture and design, and so key issues around Reconstruction and nationalism, et cetera, are important themes in that course. In other cases, I think that the local becomes more significant than the national register. And as Peter said, what's on hand is actually in some ways more significant, and because we're dealing with maybe even more fundamental or broader themes. One thing that I think is really important to do, and I do as much as I possibly can in this regard, is try to get students to work with the Canadian material, because there's so much work that is to be done on Canadian material. And our MA students find themselves getting published. Thank you, Jess. And so, they go on and they continue to do deep archival kind of work because of the resources that we have in Ottawa. But I think that everybody, regardless of where you're teaching, that you have on hand. And so that's a really exciting proposition, I think, for students, not only at the master's level or graduate levels, but also at the undergrad level. And as I said before, I mean, the idea of the virtual museum in a way is to showcase undergraduate research, because undergrads do important research, right? And it would be nice to showcase that and help to fill out more of that picture. Yeah, so I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but it's an answer to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jane, what about you?
I think I'll say yes and, if that's a legitimate category, because as you saw, that even in a very limited description, that course is so fundamentally about this place. And the conditions of Toronto are shaped by the fact of Toronto in Canada. There's a geographic history, a geological history, a social history, a legislative history, a hydrological history that are specific to here, and that can't be considered generically. So yes, I think that this is a course about the Canadian landscape, or one Canadian landscape, I think I should say, not all Canadian landscapes, but this Canadian landscape. And it's also a course about learning how to look. So the idea is that we use this Canadian landscape as a kind of case study that teaches people habits of mind and practices of observation and drawing that they can take with them when they go to other places.
Great, thank you. So two things. One is I put a note in, if anyone in the group, the audience, so to speak, or anyone has comments, please add them to the chat, or signal or unmute, and we will call on you for questions, but please feel free to add them into the chat. I wanted, if I could, to follow up on sort of staying with this question about the opportunities for the study of architecture in Canada. And I mean, Michael, you had mentioned that so much needs to be done. I mean, especially in terms of thinking for undergraduates, but also graduate students. I mean, where do you think the need is greatest, or the opportunities are greatest for students to begin to work on projects? I mean, are there particular areas that haven't been just sort of whole fields that haven't been worked on that need attention. And this, of course, is to anyone. But, sort of where do you think those opportunities are primarily?
I guess I can start on this. That's a really, really good question. And it's a really tough question because, as I said, I think, because there's so much possibility here, any number of directions could be taken depending on students' interests. I mean, I think we would agree that Indigenous studies should be up the ladder. I think questions around post-national or transnational issues and that sort of thing are also really important. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about Canada as a post-colonial state is the fact that when you dig into the local deeply, you find that you're global, right? And so you can do some really interesting things that work on a variety of different scales. But there's so much, there's so much work to be done on gender and space in this country. I mean, there's just, you name it. And even just whole areas. I mean, there's so much work to be done just on design history. I realize that's for some kind of tangential to architecture, but industrial design history, interior design history. I mean, there's vast swaths of space to look at. So I think in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do at Carleton is to get students really excited about the challenges and opportunities of working on the built environment or the designed environment and follow their passions because they'll do better work that way. But I don't know, I'll open it up to the others.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, and again, open to the audience, please. It's meant to be a conversation. So if people have things they want to add or either typing into the chat.
I'll certainly agree with Michael. In a way, the question would be a lot easier to answer if you said, can you list all the things that have been covered thoroughly? Because that would only take a couple of minutes. I mean, it's such a wide open area. All the things that Michael mentioned are so promising and so compelling. I think you could make a case that perhaps the theme of Indigenous architecture, Indigenous building, Indigenous space has certainly one of the greatest, or perhaps the most ethical urgency, in a sense, for Canada as a country. It's not the only one with ethical urgency, certainly, but it's certainly one that I think really requires a lot of thorough research. And there's so much to do. I mean, whatever it was, 3 or 4 summers ago, I went up with Pierre Dupre, who's here today, into Nunatsiavut, but looking at things there. There's contemporary Indigenous informed architecture. There's historic architecture built by Moravian missionaries. The whole area, architecturally speaking, is a contact zone, and there's so much compelling work that hasn't been done yet and needs badly to be done. And that's something I hope that our students' generation will really pick up and carry somewhere.
Great, thank you. Jane, I mean, anything?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think about a lot is how how landscapes get taken for granted. I mean, and how there's a kind of a cartoonish understanding of the Canadian landscape that, at least in settler culture, that it's about being in a canoe in Algonquin Park, but it completely ignores the calamity of Sudbury. And I won't even talk about the disruption of Indigenous relationships to land. And so one thing I think is important for all of us, just as citizens and as landscape citizens, is to get at the complexity and the plurality of the forces that make our landscapes what they are. And I want to say landscapes in the plural because they're very particular. And so there might be a set of themes that are common, but I think also coming to terms with the range of places, in this enormous country, is that's something interesting, just to try to get your head around the scope of that.
Great, thank you.
Christy, if I might jump in, it looks like we have some comments in the chat.
Thank you.
Marie Jose says the architecture of the Noonangat should be a priority. So she's in full-hearted agreement with you, Peter, that the Arctic is a pressing concern. And Vicky offers a comment to Michael and Peter. Thank you for your great presentation. She's painting her new Edinburgh house as she speaks. She's on the Heritage and Development Committee and happy to facilitate access to resources for students. And she's left her email address for you in the chat. So copy that down ASAP.
Great. So maybe we can come back now to the issue of digital tools. And this is something that you all, we had on our list to ask you about. You all have already kind of discussed technology in your presentations. But I wanted to follow up with another question about technology and digital technology specifically and the pandemic. And kind of if you see any of the adaptations that you've had to make in your teaching during this past year, as potentially productive and for your teaching in the future. In other words, can you just not wait to get back to the way things were, or have you discovered new uses for the technologies, or different pedagogical strategies that have come to you as a result of necessity during this era when we're all online, that you think may inflect the way that you teach going forward?
Jane. Oops.
I'd love to talk about that, because I have to say I thought I was going to lose my mind when I was designing this field course. I mean, I just couldn't imagine how it would be. But something kind of amazing came out of it. There was on the Miro board a piece I didn't show you. It's this giant thing, much too big for a single screen capture. But we made a map of the world, and everyone had to locate himself or locate herself on it. And then each person had to put a picture of himself or herself on his or her street. And then each person did this very kind of structured work to try to understand his or her own environment that then got shared with the group. And as a result, I wound up knowing so much more about my students and where they come from and what kinds of landscapes have shaped their consciousness than I've ever known, because the way our course works, it's the first moment of the master's course. And so people arrive and sometimes they're just barely off the plane from all kinds of places across the country and around the world. And, I start schlepping them around Toronto on foot without having any notion about the picture they bring with them, about the environment. So for me, that was so rich and so useful. And I think for the whole group too. And it's something that I'd like to try to keep doing, even when we're trudging uphill again together.
Wonderful.
Michael,
I
Peter.
wouldn't mind. Oh, sorry. Did you want to go, Michael? Oh, yeah, actually, that's something I'd like to address, because I have to admit, sort of like Jane, pedagogically, the outcome of the pandemic has not been at all what I expected. The adaptation was extraordinarily difficult, but it has really changed my notion of pedagogy and what is possible. And what I've found, and it depends on the kind of course, but there are a couple, the course I taught last term and one I taught this term that are just straight big lecture courses where I stand up in front of the group every week and deliver tons of content. And what I discovered was that teaching that course to 230 students last semester asynchronously, I could turn each week's content into a number of smaller bite-sized pieces of asynchronous pre-recorded content that worked really, really well for them. doing so was an unbelievable amount of work, but it worked really, really well for them. And I know that because they told me again and again in student feedback and that sort of thing. And so that made me think, if I can deliver that sort of content effectively in this asynchronous way that has so many advantages for them, according to what they tell me, but I could have contact hours again, what could I use those contact hours for instead of just delivering this material? If that's already in the can, could I use the contact hours for much more informal, much more interactive conversation about key themes? And so actually for both of the lecture courses I'm teaching asynchronously this year, I'm teaching them blended next year. That core lecture content is going to be delivered asynchronously online. I'm going to meet with them weekly or bi-weekly in smaller groups. And we're going to do stuff. We're going to talk about stuff. I'm going to give them things to do. It's going to be interactive. They'll do some group work. They'll interact with one another as well as with me. But I thought I can use those contact hours in a completely different, more dynamic way because I've spent 1.5 million hours preparing this asynchronous kind. I see Jess nodding knowingly. She knows exactly where I'm coming from. So that's what I plan to do. Actually, I should mention, I mean, full disclosure here, before I went into academia, I had about 10 years experience in audiovisual production. And if I hadn't had that, I don't know what I would have done this year. I think I might have died. As it is, I almost died.
You had the ideal preparation for this pandemic.
It's true. But it really has transformed my sense of what is possible. I mean, for a medieval course I'm teaching this year, I'm doing some more asynchronous lectures, but I'm also doing some of the asynchronous material as podcasts where I'm recording conversations with experts in various aspects that we're studying, editing them, doing a little mixing with some other material and posting those podcasts. And that's part of the required reading, so to speak, of the course. And I thought, why didn't I think of this before? I used to do lots of audio production, but the fact that I could make it an integral part of course content would never have occurred to me if we hadn't had a pandemic. So yeah, it's been absolutely transformative for me. It's been a little tiring, but transformative.
I'll just jump in. Yeah, I was hoping, Peter, you were going to say that you actually do video production, right? Like, I mean, that's one of the things that you know, your students really benefit from. Frankly, I can't wait to get back in front of a class again. I can't wait to actually see people and actually, you know, go places together. I think that is, you know, we're really feeling that loss right now, especially in our second year core course. You know, the experiencing architecture class. What do you do when you can't actually go out and experience architecture? So one of the again silver linings, I guess, for this is that it forced us to be creative. Okay, well, you can't do it this way, so how are you going to deal with it? And so again, thankfully, I was working with Peter on this course. We came up with a whole new strategy, and it became much more about phenomenology in a way, right? And so we dealt with architecture and the senses, and so we had students developing, you know, working on visual representations and thinking about that, and then we had them doing oral things. So they produced soundscapes and then podcasts. And we even had them, you know, try to interpret and make some kind of representation of the smell or the impact of smell on space or on the impact of touch or taste. And so, and they came up with really interesting responses to it. And I think it got them thinking about architecture in a different way. Because, and again, we didn't have that built in before. Some of the assignments were kind of similar, but for the most part, it was a complete rebuild. And I think moving forward, we're going to keep that stuff and then actually go and see buildings. So hopefully, you know, there'll be a happy marriage. So I guess in some ways, the best art comes out of being constrained. And so that there we found ourselves coming up with something a little bit more creative, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I can just share the experience that Christy and I had last semester. She and I co-taught an introductory course on Canadian architecture. And we had also in no way planned this to be an online course originally when we first conceived it, but we were originally going to have the students work in groups and give presentations at the end on each student presenting on an endangered building or an endangered site in Canada. And as a result of moving online, we instead had them produce short videos kind of profiling their sites. And we were apprehensive about how this was going to work, but the students really took to the assignment. I mean, they really loved the idea that they were making videos that, potentially other people could see, not just for Christy and me, but that could go out in the real world and could actually raise, awareness about these endangered places. So I would just echo the comments of some of the panelists that necessity was the mother of invention in this case, but it definitely has taught me something about teaching, and will change the way that I think about pedagogy going forward.
Before I ask another question, does anybody want to jump in who's here? Just unmute and ask a question. Sort of looking at the audience. If anybody, Maria Jose.
I want to say something.
Yeah. Yes, please.
I'm quite impressed, I must say, and so I rather say it out loud than hiding in emails, messages. I listen to you and I'm impressed. I'm not teaching right now. I'm on the secondment to the new French university, so I don't have this experience that many of you have here. So I guess what I feel is I'm frightened, because I can imagine the amount of work you had to do this year. But listening to you, Peter, I also find that we need to ask for more training, or more, like you have that, you're an AV person before, but we don't. And how can we actually achieve that at the level of professionalism that you're able to do? And I think that, we do have to ask for more, what they call in French, a technopedagogue, or people who can actually really support us in these endeavor. And again, I'm really, really impressed and frightened, because what am I going to do when I go back to OCAD? If I do go back, it's frightening to see the amount of the curve, the learning curve behind that. And it's also very, very inspiring. So I wanted to let you know that. So it's just a comment.
May I say something to your point, which I think is a really good one? One of the things that I did was to make these little video interviews and walks with the people I told you about from different points of view. And I've got to tell you, they weren't fancy. Like we did it with a mobile phone of a graduate student, and, she edited them on her computer. So I know that they didn't have anything like the polish of what I'm sure Peter put forward. But on the other hand, the content came through, and I was kind of grateful and relieved that none of the students said things like, "Whoa, that really looks like you did it, at home in your backyard," which was the truth. They just said it was so interesting to hear from Ange and Jen and Doug and Daniela and you and Sandy. Like they were so. I was very heartened by their willingness to look to the content and not get too fussed about the vicissitudes of the, we had a little stabilizing device for the mobile phone that sometimes did things like that. And, nobody seemed to really mind. So not so bad.
I mean, jump in, what the course that Joseph and I did in the fall, and I think we could have even done more of this, but one of the things that it made us realize is that we could invite people to come and speak to our class from anywhere. I mean, they didn't, it didn't involve an airplane ticket. It didn't involve, it was very easy to be able to ask someone, I mean, to be honest, give them a small honorarium, to say thank you for coming, and have them come and give a talk. And the students, I think, really, that was pretty exciting for them. And I mean, this is a project which, some of you may know about this from other places. The GAHTC, the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, which is this project sort of initially founded out of MIT by Mark Yarzenbeck. They've been having conferences about teaching and have created a sort of master list of people who have volunteered that they will come and give a lecture in your class about whatever it is. And I think that's sort of solving immediate problems. But I think that opportunity for students to hear other voices and to hear other people is really great. So, Marie Jose, it's not so bad. Even
you know what?
even
Jessica asked. Yeah, but you know what? I have to do two. Jessica asked me to do one for her class at U of T and one at OCAD. So I will have to really do it and
find
do
out
my best to be as good as you.
You find out who your friends are, and you get lots of you get to call in lots of favors down the road.
It's the same topic. You can just reuse it.
We'll talk about that.
And just a few things that have been in the post. Jess posted some of our student videos from our course in the fall. So, and this also, terrible self-plugging here about the project, but this is our YouTube channel for the Canada Constructed project. And Candace said, recommended some good programs. Panopto, I don't know, but Panopto does auto captions for accessibility purposes. Candace, can you say, sorry, are you still, Candace, can you say a little bit about what does Panopto do?
Sure. It's an editing software where you can create your lectures or your videos or whatever and upload them, and then you can edit them however you want. It's very easy. And in fact, you can include various video streams at the same time, have students pay attention to one, flip to the next. So you can go from your face slides to buildings. You can also just hit the little add button and throw in like a YouTube video or a website that you would like them to visit in the middle of your lectures. You could put in Quizlets, for example, if you've never used Quizlets. They're kind of a fun, test your knowledge type thing you can give to students and add them in wherever. I mean, I use them now in my online courses as a checklist at the end of the week. Like, did you learn, whatever terminology? I mean, this semester I'm teaching actually the philosophy of art. So it's a lot of philosophical jargon that they need to know. So I'm using things like that. But Panopto is very easy, and the auto captioning is actually pretty good. Other than grammatical errors, it generally will get your words pretty accurate. So you don't have to spend hours kind of editing the captioning that we need for accessibility, or at least I'm at Humber and we have to have accessibility. So we have to caption everything from meetings through to lectures. So anyways, it's just a very useful program, very, very simple to use.
Thank you. And Jess said Camtasia. What does Camtasia do? Jess?
It's similar. It's an editing, video and audio editing tool, but like with Panopto, like Candace was saying, you can capture your screen, you can, turn it around, capture your face, you can add things in. And I've found it very user-friendly. Like, it's just as easy for me now as PowerPoint. But like Peter, I've been putting a lot of hours. That's why I was laughing when he was saying, the amount of time that goes into it, because I've been trying to make my lectures, quite condensed, but really, really good, because these are my sort of perennial classes that I teach over and over. So I figure, let's try to, get it together, do it right the first time, and then next time going in is maybe not quite as backbreaking, and I can focus a bit more on those teaching moments and the learner-centered part of it. Like Peter was saying, the kind of flipped classroom model, even if we are back in person. So I'm a fan of Camtasia, but I'm going to check out Panopto. So thanks, Candace, for that, the recommendation.
One question that I wanted to sort of get back to the Canada side of things for a moment. And this partly, I mean, Jane was talking about how the pandemic has actually connected you more with your students' home world, where they're coming from and their own experiences. But one of the things that Joseph and I were thinking about as we're developing this project and sort of what are our goals with it, is that I'll say just broadly for all of us at Canadian universities, we have incredibly diverse student body and that are coming from everywhere. And how do we, if our goal, we have students coming from everywhere and we're trying to teach to get them to do research in our Canada courses on Canada topics. How do you make that transition? What are the kinds of tools? What ways do you have, or problems, things you're thinking about how to get this really diverse student body who are coming from, not having a great background in this. They may have wonderful background in other architectures or other places, but how do you make those sort of transitions, make those kinds of connections? Or is it something that you don't really address in your classes?
Christy, I'd love to talk about that because part of what has always been the starting point of the field course is to say, we have people here from all over the world, and we have no way to know exactly where everybody comes from. And this landscape, the Toronto and regional landscape, gives us something that we can all experience together and we can all come to know together. So the landscape becomes a kind of almost like a shared text that people have in common, and they can bring their own points of view to it. And then we can talk about the differences in their points of view about the same thing.
So you see it, it's actually a kind of advantage that.
Oh, it's wonderful, right? Because it's really, it's really interesting to hear what different people make of the same place. And it can be quite revealing about their own concerns and the concerns that they have brought with them from away. Or the concerns they have, if they've spent their whole lives, right around the corner.
But haven't really looked at it in the way that you're offering.
I would say it's pretty much a universal thing. When I have taught the course in person, that people who have grown up in Toronto say, I had no idea that this was here. And what I kind of loved about the pandemic version of the course was that people said that about the places that they had been living their whole lives as well. It was a very big range of places. We had 30 students from, like I said, from all over the world.
And Jane, that's a graduate course, right? That's
it is,
in the master's.
Yeah. It's a first-year master's level course.
I'm curious if you have tried to teach anything similar at the undergraduate level, or if you think that that the same principle obtains at the undergraduate level, or if that makes a difference.
I think absolutely it could. I haven't taught this course at the undergraduate level because our undergraduate curriculum doesn't allow for it. But I don't see any reason that it wouldn't make sense. I think it's often useful to be able to look at the same stuff and think about it as a kind of shared subject of analysis. Sort of like the blind people and the elephant. Everybody feels something different, and everything that they apprehend contributes to a synthetic understanding of what the elephant might be.
That's great.
If I can jump in, partly just to agree with everything Jane said about this topic. I agree to get everyone bring their own experiences to a shared thing like Toronto or Ottawa. Once we can do that again is extremely valuable, but also in relation to something Jane mentioned earlier, in this big first year undergraduate intro survey to the history of architecture I taught last semester and I teach every September. One of the revelations to me was leaning more on the discussion form. And so each week I divided the class up into small discussion groups. So they were just discussing it with a group of a dozen or so rather than a group of 250. And each week I would post a question, and the question would be related to some theme that from that week, a fundamental theme that week. So for example, the week we did Byzantine architecture, and I talked about the Hagia Sophia and Justinian and all that. The theme for the discussion forum was power, architecture and power. And I said, tell us about a building where you are that in some way communicates power. It could be a government building, a sacred building, it could be a military building, could be a commercial building, doesn't matter, but something that exudes and sends that message of power. And of course, 230 students in an asynchronous first year course, they are all over the world, literally. And it was astonishing what came out of that. I mean, I saw the amazing, fascinating things that I had never seen or heard of before. I learned more about my students in that class than I would ever have done had we been meeting in a lecture hall every week for 2 hours. It was really an eye-opening experience for me. And it really made so tangible this sense that, yes, they're in this course because they're interested in architecture. Everyone has experienced architecture. The more I can invite them to bring what they have to the table and to connect the dots between it and the big historical themes that we're talking about in the course, the better. And I found I could do that asynchronously, and I'm really looking forward to doing it in person once we're able to do that again.
Do you find, I mean, this is sort of a question for all of you. I mean, these are very positive takes on having an extremely a globalized student body. But I'm curious if there are also challenges that you encounter of having students in the classroom who maybe just don't come with the same frame of reference that you would have expected, or are sort of from such disparate social, cultural backgrounds that that you're actually forced to sort of cover some more ground than that you would have expected to. Is that an issue that you deal with in teaching Canadian material?
Well, I'll start off there, and I'll give you a completely honest answer. And that is, I was actually disabused quite some time ago of the assumption that even a much more homogenous group of students would come into a classroom with the experiences and expectations and assumptions that I thought they would. So it never worked before, and it wouldn't work now. But that's not actually a big shock, because we're talking about the diversity of Canadian architecture before. I mean, the diversity of a classroom full of Canadian students is massive. A classroom full of Canadian, just Canadian students is actually an incredibly varied human landscape. So a classroom full of international students is a differently varied human landscape. But I gave up some time ago, assuming that the cultural experiences and memories that I bring into the classroom are going to be all that closely related to that of any of my students.
I would just reiterate. I mean, I think I haven't had that experience of students have feeling as though they weren't able to keep up or whatever because they were working on Canadian material. I would say, if anything, the biggest challenge for some international students and some Canadian students, frankly, is writing and clarity of expression. And to me, that's more of an issue than say the content stuff. And thankfully we do have writing services and that sort of thing. But I would say that helping students, all the students, whether they are great writers or not, work on clarity of expression in their work is what we do in every single class with every single assignment, practically, with the exception of the experiencing architecture thing, where we're doing things like photo essays and that sort of thing. And just to that point, one of the things that was interesting this year, which I'm not sure we'll see again, Peter, but is when we had students going out and they had to document something that they had access to. So we had students in like St. Kitts or Marrakesh or whatever, and the photo essays that they produced were really, really interesting. And the podcast and the kind of sounds and like you could see the humidity in the photographs, right? So yeah, it was really kind of an excellent experience there. And the last point on that front too is just to emphasize something that Peter had said. It's the power of the podcast and the voice. When we had those assignments, we just, there's a kind of intimacy about of the human voice. And so having students doing things where they speak to you, I thought was really, really powerful, and allowed for a kind of connection that was really interesting. And in some ways, the students found that was much easier than, say, producing a text, and they got their point across even better in a way. So just for what it's worth.
Thank you. So Joseph and I are conscious of the time, and everybody's, even in the early weeks of the semester, Zoom fatigue. So any final questions? We're really grateful for the opportunity to see people and the conversation. And so I'll sort of look around. Any final questions in the chat or comments? We do hope to do, sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to thank Michael and Peter for telling us about the online museum, because one thing I've wondered a lot about as a teacher is what to do with all this amazing work that gets produced. And then it just goes into a, digital file folder. And so I think it's very inspiring to hear about how your students' research has a life in the world where it can be shared with people. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you. And your course, the field course, sounds just phenomenal. I love the interdisciplinary approach to it. So yeah, hopefully one day the stuff that we have been collecting from the students will actually be able to put out in the world, but small steps, but yeah, thanks.
One thing that to Michael and Peter and Jane, we have this, what we hope is sort of a clearinghouse that is not only about the stuff that Joseph and I are doing, and Jess and Katrin, but also really as a place to bring together information for, primarily student oriented rather than, not that it won't be about research as well, but student oriented. And we put the link in. Actually, I'll ask Jess if you could just type the link in one more time. So if you're doing great things like Michael and Peter would love to highlight your project, and Jane put something up, kind of can be linking to the Daniels. So we will be in touch with you, but to have that, but please do, everyone, if you haven't already, sign up for the newsletter, which we've sent out one so far. We're going to, that came at the end of our first semester, that will be kind of ongoing. And we do hope, this, from my point of view, I think this was a wonderful success. It was lovely to hear and incredibly informative to hear from everyone, and to have the chance to get together and to sort of connect. We hope to be doing these regularly. I would say maybe every 4 to 6 weeks to do one on different topics. So please do sign up so you get the announcements about them. And this is something even post-pandemic we'll probably continue to do, maybe sometimes in person, but easily enough done online. And I think, Joseph, any final thoughts before we say goodbye, and everyone have a good night and stay healthy?
That's great. Stay healthy and have a good semester. And thanks especially to our panelists and to everybody who joined us.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.